Okay, the thing I want to get at now, as we start to look at these examples today, is that artists are following the Western tradition of progress, just like all other aspects of society. And artists are getting bored with technique. They're getting bored with doing the same thing that Renaissance artists and Baroque artists did. And they're saying to themselves, like scientists almost, what's more fundamental to this business of painting and sculpture than just likeness, than just realism or naturalism? And the point that they're making is, like scientists who examine the atomic and the subatomic world in the modern era, artists are breaking down the appearance of things into these basic elements. And you'll notice in your first note there about ideas, we're talking about the visual elements. Just like we think of elements in terms of minerals, we're talking about the most fundamental parts of what we see. And you'll notice I list a series of things there. Color, line, shape or mass, if you project it into 3 dimensions. Value, which is dark and light. Those are basic elements. And when we teach art, at least in the modern era, we often we start curriculum often with courses that are called composition or design. And we do a series of projects that emphasize individual elements. Now that's exactly what you're going to see in the next 5 weeks or so. You're going to see individual works emphasizing elements. And now if you look at this painting, I had a strategy in asking you about it. Where is shape? You can hardly find any shapes there. Where is value? There is a minor variation between light and dark, but very, very little. The dominant element there is color. And even that is not all that dominant. Okay, now we're going to get started with the real art of the period here. Keep in mind the historical events that we list at the top of our sheet. You've got the Industrial Revolution, you've got photography, and you've got Darwinism. And those are 3 events that are fundamentally going to shape the kind of art we're going to be looking at. John, this is actually a scene that was on, Constable's father owned a large tract of land, and many of Constable's nature paintings were done on that tract of land. And this is, of course, called the hay wain, and I assume a hay wain is this wagon here. But you notice how beautiful and bucolic it is. This painting is done when the English are totally tearing apart their landscape to mine tin, to dig coal. The whole Industrial Revolution wasted huge sections of English countryside. And notice this painting completely ignores that. It's just a gorgeous, beautiful painting, but there's something in this painting, though, that allows us to talk about it as modern. Because Constable is an artist who is what sometimes we call him a pre-impressionistic painter. The Impressionists all venerated Constable. He painted before they did, but he got this idea to make nature look alive, not just to be exact likeness of it, but to do things with the surface of his painting to make it look like light was flickering off of surfaces. He constantly, you have to get close to a Constable to see this, but there are little dots of white everywhere in the painting. Now, one of the issues with white is white comes towards the eye and black goes away from the eye. By putting those little white dots everywhere, it gives the painting a kind of flickering, lively look about it. And so he's a good example of artists already starting to mess around with visual elements and the way they affect nature representation. We saw this one in one of our last presentations. This is a royal pavilion. It's one of the English palaces. I don't know about you guys, but you know, I watch public television all the time, and they're always showing these English programs. Do you need 10 or 15 palaces? I mean, what does it cost to maintain a palace? This is one of those royal palaces, and this is a good example of the same kind of romanticism that we saw in the Constable. It's an exotic-looking building, doesn't look like English architecture at all. It looks like some sort of Far Eastern architecture or some Islamic type structure. It has these grills and so on that we associate with mosques. It's an English palace. It's again avoiding the context in which it's being built. Strangely enough, to make this strange looking structure with these fake minarets and so on, you have to have iron. Underneath that strange looking kind of wedding cake look is iron, which of course is a main product of the Industrial Revolution. You couldn't build a building like this with the old materials. You need iron to do a structure like this. This will be, I think, our last romantic example. This is a work by Delacroix, Eugène Delacroix. It's a huge work. Look at the measurements there. 12 feet by 16 feet, 3 inches. Now, the measurement has something to do with the nature of this painting, because one of the things we know about Delacroix is he is one of the artists who is most interested in the development of photography. In fact, we even have portraits of Delacroix, and we know exactly what he looked like. He was really fascinating with photography. But being an artist, he realized the implications of this photography business. Do we need artists anymore if you can just automatically, with not a lot of rigmarole, and very quickly create a likeness? And his reaction to that was, well, let's do things that photographs can't do. That's one of the reasons this painting is 16 feet wide. How many photographs are you going to feed 16 feet back in the 1800s? That's also the reason this painting is vividly colored. No color photography in the 1800s. And that's also the reason this painting is full of turbulent movement everywhere. This is before Muybridge came along and did his action studies of the human body. So although the painting seems just exotic, you know, the whole idea is this Oriental potentate he's being invaded. His town is being invaded by another force, and he's lying on this grand bed, and he's having his harem slaughtered and his horses killed. There is sort of smoke in the background. It's a painting of death and destruction. And the whole idea here is this incredible turbulence of the line of the painting. And Delacroix, that's characteristic of Delacroix's painting. Now we're going to start to look at realism. Now, when we say realism here, we're not necessarily just talking about the fact that it looks more or less naturalistic, but we're also saying it's starting to deal with the here and now. It's dealing with the world as we see it in the mid-19th century. This is Courbet's Stonebreakers, and it's not the kind of subject matter that's beautiful or poetic. It simply represents a kind of activity, a real activity. Roads need to get built, and some people need to break rocks apart to be able to make those roads. And you'll notice how he creates this sort of flat space. He's got one figure who's holding this basket of rocks. He looks like a very young boy. Then you got the guy with the hammer, looks like he's breaking the rocks, and he looks quite elderly. It's mind-numbing, dumb work. And the modern world is full of mind-numbing, dumb work. And Courbet was politically a socialist. And he wanted the world to see what it was creating when it moved towards an industrial format. You'll notice his colors are very conservative compared to the painting we just saw, because his theme is a much different kind of theme. And so everything about it is, in some ways, muted. But strangely enough, Courbet knew a lot about art history. And you notice how he's lined these figures up. The painting has a rather shallow space, at least the foreground, where the two figures are standing. And often in these realist paintings, these artists were looking back to the past, and some of the poses you see are lifted from Greek and Roman sculptures. I don't say Greek and Roman paintings because hardly any paintings exist from those societies, but lots of sculptures. This is again Courbet, and look at the scale of this thing. It's 22 feet across. It's almost as big as the front of this room. It's probably pretty close to the size of the front of this room. Ornans was a town that Courbet grew up in. Small, little, unimportant hamlet in France. And people in that town could look at this painting and recognize some of their portraits in this painting. But basically, what he's doing, look at the coloring again. Notice how somber the coloring is. There's a sense, even though you see a crucifixion in the background there, which is really in the background, you see it stands above the sky, but this figure has a staff, and the crucifixion is on the staff. The whole thing you don't get any heavenly vision here. Look at that sky in the background. It's gray. It kind of reminds me of Ohio winters. Gray, misty, rainy. You get clusters of people. You get a lot of women over here, and they look like, they're not looking at what's going on. Here's your burial pole. It looks like they're sort of milling around. They look like they're walking that way. All their faces seem to be pointed that way. Then you've got the church officials here in the center. And what's a dog doing there? You see, it's almost anti-religious. Previous treatments of subjects like this would try to include a psychological, emotional kind of sense of renewal, of a regeneration. You get almost no sense of that here at all. It's just, this is the way it is. It's gray. It's uneventful. There it is. It's reality. This is a work by Manet. Now, I have to admit, as I talk about various artists, I have to constrain myself when I talk about Manet because I think he's such an amazing painter. But you don't get that until you can walk up to a Manet. And fortunately, I taught in Chicago, which has a great art institute. And Impressionist, post-Impressionist, realist paintings are everywhere in the Chicago Art Institute because American McCormick's, Ryerson's, all of those people were wealthy, modern American industrialists. They go over to France and buy boatloads of paintings. And they got rich when these artists were doing these kinds of paintings. Anyway, Manet's Olympia is part of a tradition of female nude figures in Western art. It started in the Renaissance. A guy named Giorgione first started this subject of the nude female figure, and his first painting with this subject was a female figure sort of sleeping in a bucolic landscape. There was nothing erotic about it. She was beautiful. It was just simply a way of making her belong in nature, being a part of nature, and it was a whole Renaissance idea that God has made this world and made all the beautiful things in this world. And so in a strange way, it was a kind of reverential painting. Then he taught, one of his most famous students was a guy named Titian. And Titian made a painting, which is also, by the way, at the Chicago Art Institute, called Danae. And it's a female nude like this, but you see she's lying on this couch, and then you see these flickers of light coming from the top of the painting, like sunlight coming into the painting. And rather than just stretched out, her body is more in a kind of receptive shape. And the whole concept here, this is a Greek myth. Danae was a beautiful Grecian woman, and Apollo wanted to mate with her, and he came to her in a shower of light. So the painting starts to have a kind of erotic overtone, but you have to know the myth to even get that concept. Now, when you look at this figure, I don't think you need to know any myths to figure out what's going on here. And by the way, to help you unwrap that, commonly when they showed the reclining nude, there was a little animal that was on the bed or next to the bed. And if you look carefully, here's a black cat. Well, the animal that typically was on the bed was a dog, a puppy. Now, the generic word we use for dog names is Fido. Fido comes from the Latin fidelity, faithfulness, the idea they had to sanctify that nude scene by having an animal there that represented stability and faithfulness and so on. Manet has a black cat there, and obviously he's really playing on this erotic overtone. And of course, you notice the irony of that title, Olympia, a Greek name, but basically what we've got there is probably a French prostitute. She's not represented in an ideal body type. He could have easily done that. He was a very gifted realist, but he represents her in a body type that doesn't quite match the ideal. She looks like a rather small person, and the most distinctive thing about her is the way she looks at us. This tradition started with the woman asleep, sort of just like a part of nature. She was unconscious. Danae starts to be aware, and this figure dares us to judge her. She sits there absolutely without a stitch of clothes on and just looks at us in this bold, direct way. This is the real world. This is the world of French prostitutes. Now, the other thing about the painting, though, is that she's represented with almost no shadows. You get this deep, dark background. You have this Negro woman who's holding this bouquet that one of her admirers has probably sent her. We can barely see her because of the dark background. Again, the cat, if I didn't point it out, you probably wouldn't even see it. And then the nude is represented to us mostly as outlines. You'll notice how her body is hardly shaded at all. Manet is starting to examine not necessarily color, but shape. He doesn't want values. He flattens out his paintings. He gets rid of a lot of values, and he's emphasizing shape and outline. And he somehow plays with that so that, for instance, he will contrast things. If you look at that bouquet of flowers, it's done in a very painterly way. Yet the figure itself is outlined and hard-edged. And so he's mixing both of those ways of painting. But again, it's the whole idea of starting to not only just have the world as it is, but also start to present it in ways that investigate what painting really is. This particular painting caused a huge stir. You notice I use the word ambiguous in a brief descriptor for the painting. Why are these two guys all dressed, and why are the women undressed? One of them it looks like she's having some sort of a bath in the background. You have this other woman who appears to be totally nude. Again, notice how she looks out at us. She's not embarrassed. She's not self-conscious that she doesn't have clothes on. And by the way, the people in Paris knew who these people were. These are actual real people. I think the figure next to the nude woman is Manet's brother-in-law. And one of the critics at the time, when the painting was shown, said not only is the painting morally degenerate, but it's as flat as a bunch of playing cards. It's technically incompetent. Now, he wasn't technically incompetent. He was very, very gifted technically. But again, look at the hard edge, only a little toning here in the lower thigh, but everything else about her is simply an outline. The whole painting is kind of flattened out. But he loves still life, so he always found a way to get some kind of still life in there where he could use a little more painterly approach. But again, realism in the sense that this is the modern French world. Ambiguous things happen. And do we judge them? Don't we judge them? Are we able to see them simply as visual things meant to be visual experiments? Or do we say, no, this is degenerating society? And that was an issue at the time, and it remains an issue today. Now you can really start to see what I'm talking about with the Pfeiffer. The first reaction to this painting is a cute boy as a kind of decorative form. And I think he intentionally chose that subject matter that way, so that the first reaction is to just see it as this young boy who's playing an instrument. But notice where he puts him. He puts him nowhere. There is no there. It's just a totally ambiguous background, more or less a uniform kind of greenish gray color. And that allows him, again, to emphasize edges. And especially you see that with his black jacket and hat. He's really thinking about the rhythm of the pose and the characteristic outlines that represent the figure. Not only do you have black there, but you get these stripes down the edge of his pants and his shoes. So the whole painting, in a certain kind of way, is kind of outlined. And you're meant to look at the painting not just as this cute boy, but as a combination of shapes. In a strange way, the painting is abstract, but abstract not in the sense of unrecognizable. Abstract in the emotional sense, that you take something that you would normally have a sentimental reaction to, and you strip that all away, and you make it a visual exercise. That's really what the realists started to do, and they become the forerunners of everything we call modern art. I think that's our last image, isn't it? I wanted to leave a special amount of time today for questions, because I'm introducing this whole concept that will lead us the next several weeks. I see a hand over there. Yes?
In the picture before this one, the next to the last.
Yeah, it's luncheon on the grass, yeah.
Okay.
Can we go back to luncheon on the grass?
There. But
Oh, yeah, okay.
is that a figure with its back to us between the two men?
a figure with our back to us. You have,
A white head and a gray vest and a white sleeve. It looks like a man sitting with his back.
right here,
No, up above. Keep going up. That up there.
I think they're just 2 men and 2 women.
Okay. It looks like the back of a man.
Yeah, being up in the forest there. This probably was a French park, by the way.
Yeah. Between
Yeah.
those 2 black men, it looks like a figure.
Uh-huh.
With its back to it.
Well, see, again now, notice the scale of this painting. It's a really big painting. And when you get to a Manet, you'll see this quality of flatness that I'm talking about. And you see how the paint just takes on a life of its own. He just loved paint. He's just an amazing still life painter. The Art Institute of Chicago has a painting called Still Life with Carp. It is just an extraordinary painting. I'm not always a great fan of still life painting, but the paint in this painting is so viscous, and it takes a real skill to paint painterly, because you can't redo anything. You got to do it right the first time, because the whole idea is this active, turbulent surface. And if you start to overstudy it, you freeze the whole quality, energy in the work. Now, can I get some other questions? I'm not sure I answered that one very well. Give me one I can answer. Anyone? Yes?
When was
Lautrec? Toulouse-Lautrec is normally grouped with the post-impressionists. Some people group him with impressionists. The thing is, the reason we're really focusing our attention on realism, this approach, this look at the world the way it really is approach, carries through several other movements. And Lautrec, of course, he's most noted for his cafe scenes and so on. That, of course, was the world that he lived in. So it has a realist premise, but chronologically, he comes later than some of these other artists we're talking about. And so he'd be a post-impressionist. And post-impressionists tend to go towards a very emotional approach towards the subject matter. Manet is, there's emotion in the work, but it's mostly distant. It's mostly intellectual. It's ironic that he was such a controversial artist, because there's a kind of strange quality in his temperament. He loved recognition. He dressed like a French dandy. He was a very handsome man. He dressed very well. He wanted recognition, but he had such a commitment to the art of painting, and he knew the paintings he was making would not be popular. But he persisted anyway. He almost couldn't help himself. Any other questions I can help you with? Yes?
What is the significance of, in the one before this, of the nude woman, the prostitute?
Olympia? Yeah.
Yeah, Olympia. And the contrast between her very whiteness and the whiteness of the bed and the dark African-American woman there. Light and dark, anything about that? Sort of a Caravaggio thing?
Well, I'm sure he was quite aware of the social connotations of that, because, again, he was a realist, and realists, that's the way they think. Their whole concept is not just the world the way it looks in the modern world, but the sociological positioning of people in the world. So I'm pretty sure he was aware of that. There are these conundrums in most of Manet's work. The luncheon on the grass. Why are the guys dressed? Why are the women nude? What's going on here? He doesn't explain that. He just uses them as a starting point for his showing his way of painting.
Along those lines, that was my question. What was going on in society with the male-female relationship that the woman is nude and the men are fully dressed? I'm not.
Well, it's, this is going to get more complicated as we move along with these sessions. But there's obviously implied a kind of male hierarchy here. And that pretty much represents that in this particular painting. But that doesn't necessarily mean, remember, an artist, when he represents something, doesn't mean they're endorsing what they're representing. They're just representing what they see in the world. And I honestly can't say very much about Manet's personal life. So I'm not really ready to say too much about his attitude towards women. But like most French artists at the time, they hired prostitutes usually as their models because they were the only women who would disrobe. And they were interested in representing the human body. And so there's clearly social ambiguity in these works. And I'm not ready to say Manet intended that as a social criticism. Again, there's all this ambiguity in his work. Yeah.
In the Royal Pavilion, there's a tiny little man sitting on the steps. And is that just to show?
Oh, yeah, this figure right here.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get a sense of human scale there, yeah. Yeah. It's, and by the way, the building is just as bizarre on the inside as it is on the outside.
Where is it? You know?
It's in Brighton, which is a recreational area, a resort area in England. So it's kind of like pre-Disneyland. It's the same kind of recreational kind of world in this exotic architecture. It's not the real world at all. You can see the difference between Romanticism and realism when you see a building like this.
I got another question about this architecture. You said it has to have iron to build these onion top buildings. Are the ones that are in Moscow and the ones in the Middle East, where they
typically,
how are they made?
for instance, the typical St. Basil in the Kremlin, which is this amazing church with like 20 of these turrets, onion domes are called. St. Basil is actually a giant magnification of folk architecture. It's actually made out of wood. It's painted wood. That's why it's got all these bright colors, because it's painted wood. Where this kind of thing gets complex, you see those windows, that skylight in that main onion dome there. That's the kind of thing it's not easy to do with stone, because you see the mullions, the spacing between those windows is not very wide at all, and that upper dome got away several tons. Could that dome be held up that way with it being perforated with all those windows? unless you have iron to be able to do something like that. It's called a superstructure. It's a skeletal form beneath the building that allows you to do all kinds of daring things in space that you couldn't do with stone. You can do a little bit with wood, like St. Basil would be an example of being able to do it with wood.
The ones in the Middle East, are they made out of wood?
No, for instance, my familiarity with Islamic architecture is mostly from Spain, the Alhambra. And it's mostly stone, and plaster, I might add. And there are a lot of tiles, a lot of ceramic tiles, but it's a more conservative domical structure than you see here.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah. Yes,
I have a question about the stone breakers.
yes.
All the other pictures that we saw were of the rich and how they spent their afternoons in the park and
Mhm.
whatever. And here, he wanted to make a picture of men working.
Yeah. And by the way, that his village, the burial at Ornans, those people were just very ordinary. That's the ordinary dress you'd see in a small French village. But he, again, I can't help but refer back to Chicago. There's a wonderful painting in the Art Institute of Chicago called Mare Gregory. Gregory was a female madam at a brothel. And again, it's, it's in these kind of muted colors. You have to get close to a Courbet to really get the richness of the surface. But yeah, it's just everything is ordinary in Courbet. There is another large painting he made, which was a huge painting called History of My Life. And here he actually has a female nude standing next to him while he's painting. And she's standing there, and he's not painting her. And she represents the purity of nature, because he's saying, this is our nature. This is the world. I paint real life, and there's a moral quality in what I do. There's a kind of purity in this realism. I'm not ignoring the consequences of all the so-called advances that are surrounding us.
Were there,
Yeah.
were there many painters that did ordinary people? He very
Well, among the realists, it was, of course, part of the whole social intention of what they were trying to do. But if I try to examine other paintings and painters, most of the people who get painted are commissioning the painting. You're putting me one lecture ahead. Next time we're going to talk about galleries and how paintings get made. But most people who get painted are fairly wealthy because they're paying for the painter. And that's the way art happened before the time we're talking about. But all of a sudden, very quickly, especially in Paris, you start to have people marketing art through a system called galleries. And anyone can walk in a gallery and see a painting they like and they could buy it. It's not a direct personal transaction. You may never even meet the artist whose painting you're buying. And all of a sudden, the galleries allowed the artists to make paintings like some of these paintings we're talking about, because who would want to buy something like that? It takes a very specialized clientele. Many of these paintings were not sold. They were put in storage, and later on these artists became famous, and then the museums bought all the paintings. But that's the way art starts to happen. But typically, human representations before this time are the upper class. Yes?
Since this has been on the screen so long, I'm wondering if this is a social commentary, because the boy has on nicer pants than the man. The man's got on work pants that have been mended or had heavier cloth put on the front of his legs. And the man's wearing wooden clogs, and the boy's wearing what look like leather shoes. So maybe he was better off and wound up in this job.
I'm honestly not ready to say that I know that. Typically he represented people that he knew, but you notice how he puts the man's face in complete shadow, so he's anonymous, and the boy turns away. And what I can say, quite apart from how they're dressed, is that's intentional. You're not meant to see them as individual people. They represent the automaton, the person who has to work in the factory, who's not known as an individual anymore. And this is counter to what artists think, because the whole idea of being an artist is having an individual vision. And that's the reason we don't see either face. Now, I don't know, I have to look at my watch again. We got to get a clock in this room, folks. We got a couple minutes. Or any other questions? As far as I'm concerned, this is the best part of the class, is when you're asking me questions. So feel free to do that. Yeah?
When was Malay?
I'm sorry, what?
How did Malay fit in at the same time as Courbet? The gleaners and all those farm workers?
I'm just trying to get my chronology straight here. Millet would be a good example of a contemporary, because Millet he represents farm workers out in the fields. Typically we call these things movement, but strangely enough, these guys almost never get together. The Impressionists started to show together, but these guys come to these ideas individually, without any group, anything. They're just living in the atmosphere of the time that they're living in, and they're coming up with this way of representing art. But typically they're not doing a lot of consulting. And yet we cluster them because you can see very clear similarities and connections, but it's a chronological connection. That's what I'm saying. That's why art teaches us history almost than any other subject can. People tell me I know a lot about history. I don't really know a lot about history. History doesn't interest me. What interests me is in art, and I can tell you how people felt in the Renaissance. I can tell you how they felt in the Baroque era. I can tell you how these artists felt simply through their work. And I don't know history, I just know art. Okay, it's about time. Thank you for coming. Next time, we're going to get into the Impressionists. Impressionists and post-impressionists next time. Thank you again.
Thank you.